Bueno, y para poder retomar la agenda y a lo que nos convoca hoy día, venimos a hablar de cómo podemos transformar la ciencia en innovación, cómo podemos recoger experiencia y la trayectoria que tiene California, y en particular el rol que ha tenido la Universidad de California Davis, apoyando el desarrollo, el valor agregado y nuevas líneas y desarrollos de productos en la industria local de California. Y nuestro gran objetivo hoy día, para que lo mantengamos durante esta actividad, es poder compartir experiencias comparadas entre Chile y California, para poder ojalá enriquecer el desarrollo de nuestra industria local. Y por otro lado, conocer el aprendizaje y evolución que ha experimentado la industria cervecera en California, y cuáles son los principales drivers que hoy día impulsan la innovación y desarrollo, y que hoy día nos pueden servir de referente, de modelo y de inspiración en la escena de la industria cervecera nacional. Así que, primero que nada, agradecer también a Glenn y a Charles. Voy a dar ahora el pase a las presentaciones de nuestros keynote speakers. Vamos a partir la presentación con Charles Bamforth. Charles, como ya nos decía Mauricio, es un renombrado investigador y asesor senior en la industria cervecera, es profesor emérito y distinguido de la Universidad de California Davis, participó en los inicios de todo el desarrollo del programa de innovación e investigación de cervecería de la universidad, y dentro de sus líneas de investigación se destaca por todos los estudios en materia enzimática y el rol en la elaboración de la cerveza. También tiene una investigación respecto al potencial de los residuos de la industria cervecera y su uso como prebiótico en productos como la cerveza. Es autor de más de 20 bestsellers, que me imagino que muchos aquí de la audiencia ya habrán leído y tendrán ahí como Biblia en su velador. Así que sin alargarme más, doy la presentación para que Charles nos pueda dar su mensaje y todos sus comentarios para Chile.
It's very nice to be with you. Thank you. I hope you can see my screen. What I'd like to do today is to give you a brief history of what's happened over the years at UC Davis, and then give the floor to Glenn Fox, my successor as the Anheuser-Busch Endowed Professor at UC Davis. And brewing education and teaching really started at UC Davis in 1958. And this was the brewery that was donated to the campus in 1958 by the Lucky Lager Brewing Company from San Francisco, and a gentleman by the name of Ruben Schneider. And what Ruben Schneider did was to write to the then head of the food technology department, Emil Marak. Emil Marak became the president or the chancellor of UC Davis. This is the man in the white suit to the right here. So this was a small brewery, and Schneider wrote to Marak and said, it's about time you started teaching people how to brew beer. Already UC Davis was educating people in the production of wine, but 1958 was when beer first came onto the curriculum at UC Davis. And the first teacher was a celebrated mycologist. Then it went through one short term from a gentleman by the name of Tommy Nakayama. And then a gentleman by the name of Michael Lewis taught the brewing program for many years, from the early 60s until his retirement in the early 90s. So UC Davis has had a long-standing relationship with the brewing industry in the whole of the United States and beyond. And of course, over the years was presenting or delivering a lot of people into the industry. And probably the company that took advantage of that the most was Anheuser-Busch, the old Anheuser-Busch. And I arrived in 1999 as the Anheuser-Busch Endowed Professor. What they wanted to do was to ensure that brewing continued to be on the curriculum at UC Davis. And they realized that many of the people that will be educated, they wanted to go into the industry generally. Many of them perhaps wanted to go ahead and start their own brewing companies. But certainly Anheuser-Busch recognized that it wasn't only them that was going to take advantage of the program, and they very much wanted it to continue at UC Davis. So when I arrived in 1999, this is what I inherited. It was the same brewery. Not a lot had been invested in the program. So Anheuser-Busch really were tremendously helpful. Not only did they endow the professorship, they also, I drove to St. Louis, and they loaded up a U-Haul with lots of equipment for me. And also we built a new brewery. The gentleman on the left there next to me is Ruben Schneider. So Ruben was very glad to come back to UC Davis to see what we were doing. And you can see around us now, we'd started in the old Cruise Hall to put in place a brewery. And when we formally opened it, Doug Moorman, the guy on the left there is Doug Moorman. He was the VP of all technical issues at Anheuser-Busch. And we were very proud to actually establish this facility in the early 2000s in the old building. And then a gentleman by the name of Robert Mondavi, well known in the world of wine, and there's he with his wife, Margaret. And I insisted that I get him a photograph of him holding one of my books as well, just to show that Robert Mondavi fully recognized the importance of beer. But the Mondavis gave a huge amount of money to the university to allow us to build a new facility, the Robert Mondavi Institute. And this is an image of what the facility looks like. This, therefore, was now home to not only the Department of Food Science and Technology, wherein is the brewing program, but also the Department of Viticulture and Enology. But when we built these buildings full of wonderful laboratories, research laboratories, there was no pilot facility. So as the chairman of the Department of Food Science, I had to raise the money to put in a new pilot facility, which we did. We needed $10 million to build a new facility. And $5 million of that money came from Anheuser-Busch. In fact, a pledge from the Anheuser-Busch Foundation. And we named the building the August A. Busch III Brewing and Food Science Laboratory. But we had to move the brewery across a new facility. And it cost just $120,000 just to actually move this brewery, this 1.5 barrel US barrel brewery, remembering there's 1.1 hectoliters in a US barrel. And the rest of the money, a lot of it came from the tomato processing industry, but we had lots of other generous people as well, including Ken Grossman from Sierra Nevada, who not only gave the money which allowed us to see the Sierra Nevada Brewing Company Research Laboratory, but also helped us to actually finalize this facility. And later he endowed the brewing position. So the brewer at UC Davis is the Sierra Nevada Brewing Company endowed brewer. But lots of other people were generous as well. So we have these wonderful facilities that I'm sure that Glenn will describe in further detail later on. We've come a very long way. And this facility is available and used not only for teaching and research, but also for outreach, the three main parts of a university brewing or university brewers or university professors role. Changing tack slightly, then we have US President Jimmy Carter, and I'm not sure this is what he's signing at this time, but in 1978, he was the guy who signed into law allowing people now to brew themselves. So it made on the federal level home brewing legal. So many people who had already been brewing when they were able to consider not only developing their home brewing interests, but also developing new brewing companies. And so here we are, California, a University of California, UC Davis, a land grant university. So we are charged with the task of supporting the interests of California and of course beyond. And the history of brewing in California is a long-standing one, but probably one of the most famous names is Fritz Maytag. Fritz Maytag bought a rapidly decaying brewery called the Anchor Brewing Company in San Francisco. And many people point to Fritz as being the guy who really turned people on to brewing. He often used to tell me that he inherited the last medieval brewery in the world. But he did wonderful things, and before selling the company a number of years ago, his was the name that really was associated with championing the interest in beer. Another legend is this guy, Jack Mcauliffe. There's the before and then photograph. There he was on the left when he established his own brewing company, the New Albion Brewing Company in Sonoma, California. And he built it himself. So the second model, the first model was Fritz Maytag, inheriting a long-standing brewery. But Jack Mcauliffe, who was in the Navy, went over to Scotland, fell in love with the beer in the British Isles, and decided he wanted to make it when he got back and came out of the Navy. But of course, you couldn't get a catalog in those days. You couldn't buy small-scale brewing equipment. You had to make your own. So he made his own. And that inspired a lot of people. His business model really wasn't very good. He didn't brew enough beer. If you're going to make a living out of it, you got to sell enough beer. And he didn't really have the plans to actually develop on a significant scale. But he inspired many others. Most notable of all, certainly being this gentleman, Ken Grossman. Ken Grossman founded the Sierra Nevada Brewing Company back in 1980. And he went up and down California, bought old equipment, dairy tanks. He made his own first lauter tun. He drilled all the holes himself to make himself a lauter tun. And now, of course, he's got what I would consider probably the two most beautiful breweries in the world. The one on the top right here is the brewery in Chico, the original brewery in Northern California, about 100 miles north of where we are here in Davis. But of course, the other one on the East Coast in North Carolina at Mills River, a beautiful location, the ultimate in brewery destinations. Not only does it look great, it does, of course, makes a wonderful beer, and everything about the Sierra Nevada operations is about doing things right. And of course, it made perfect sense to build a brewery on the East Coast, because it doesn't make sense to ship beer more than 3,000 miles, because most beers are at least 90% water, and you don't want to be shipping water over vast distances. And not only that, it's better for quality to brew as close as possible to the marketplace. So this is a history of the California brewing industry, which basically comes from the California Craft Brewers Association website. And you can see back there on the left-hand side, Fritz Maytag in 1965, and then in 1977, Jack Mcauliffe with New Albion, Ken starting his brewery in 1980, various other people coming into the play, including Vinny Cilurzo in 1994 with the Russian Brewing Company. So when this the illustration was first produced, there were 850 breweries in California, and that was in 2017. Now, if you go to a year later, there's more than 1,000 breweries in California. It's a lot of brewing companies. If I could just segue slightly, you've detected the English accent now. Back in the United Kingdom, there are about 2,000 breweries, and the whole of the United Kingdom, landmass-wise, will fit into California twice. So there's still plenty of scope for the development of brewing in California, as well as in many other places as well. So as you can see, a huge economic impact, $9 billion economic impact in 2018. A lot of contribution to the state. So UC Davis, as I said before, three legs to the stool: teaching, research, and outreach. Teaching, I started a class called FST3, a general education class. It became the most popular class on campus, more than 1,000 students every year at all levels, learning about beer as a general science class. And then we put it online, this was before the days of COVID, but we put it online to make it available to other campuses within the UC system. And then the two long-standing upper division classes, FST 102A, which is the theory of malting and brewing, and 102B, which is the practical class. And these have grown immeasurably over the years, huge numbers of students. When I first came to Davis, there were about 15, 20 students in 102A. When I left, there were about 80. and similar growth in the size of 102B. To get into these classes, students have got to do all the fundamental basic science and engineering classes, very much classes 102A and 102B that a student can only take once they've done all the basic chemistry, biochemistry, chemical engineering, microbiology, and so on. But we also have continuing professional education, called University Extension. And there are many courses here, and I'll leave that to Glenn to tell you about what the current situation is now. In terms of research, the focus is very much on relevance, relevant research that is material that is accessible and useful to the industry and all associated industries. So it's always been my philosophy in more than 4 years nearly brewing industry. Whenever I do research, there's going to be some purpose towards it. It's not just blue skies research. And then, of course, we have a role to spread the good word and the promotion of beer as a worthwhile component of the society. So there's a lot of output there, but I always considered our number one output being people and the education of people, whether they are campus students or people in the brewing industry. Anywhere in the world. Of course, these days, the way we're doing business is very much online, making it possible to do things globally. Now, of course, as many of you will be aware, there's an interesting world out there in brewing. There's a lot of consolidation. Of course, a few years ago, we saw AB InBev acquiring large elements of SAB Miller and so on. And a lot of interest in the larger brewing companies in the so-called craft sector. And I always put craft in inverted commas because I consider a brewer on any scale, whether they're a very large brewing company or a very small one, as long as they're properly educated and properly trained and adept, I consider them to be craftspeople, craftsmen and craftswomen. There's a lot of innovation going on in products in the brewing industry. And of course, there is tremendous competition. Beer has no God-given right to be the beverage of choice. I personally like to think it will be the beverage of choice, but we have this concept of share of throat. There's so many different choices that people have. The traditional competition is beer versus wine, but brewers, of course, these days are innovating in all sorts of different ways and straying, should we say, from the world of beers, classic beers as we know them. Of course, COVID has had a significant effect. You know, it would very easily have been thought that the advent or the development of COVID would hit brewing hard. But actually, it's been remarkable in terms of increases in beer volumes in many places because particularly if you have put your beer in small pack cans or bottles, because then there is tremendous interest in perhaps enjoying a beer in somewhat strenuous times. Not so good for people relying on draft beer sales. That's been a big problem. Equally, in some parts of the world, I'm thinking particularly of places like South Africa, they responded in a different way, and there was a prohibition brought in. So it's been a big challenge in different parts of the world. But in terms of education, we have really turned to online systems very much and reaching people out there. And these days, people now, rather than coming to Davis to learn, they can still be at their home, they can still be dialing into the education systems without interfering with their production regime. So let me just finish my presentation by talking about some of the issues that I think are highly important. And right at the top of my list always is quality. Quality. Of course, quality means different things to different people, and different people have different ideas of what is a great beer. Some people love sour beers. I'm not a big fan of sour beers, but quality is consistency. Beer quality is achieving the target product every time. And if you meet the customer's expectation and that is their idea of quality, then you have achieved your goal. There's a lot of gimmicks going on. I'm not a big fan of gimmicks. I think the Reinheitsgebot in Germany is one step too far, just malt, hops, yeast, and water. I think that restricts too much. But equally, I'm not a big fan of putting strange materials into beer. So I think peanut butter should be left spread on bread. I wouldn't even eat it there. I certainly don't think it should be put into beer. I think the ultimate job of a brewer, first and foremost, is to make beer. And I just wish there was a tighter definition of exactly what beer must be without making it too restrictive. There's a huge amount of interest in alternative products, a lot of interest in seltzers and alcoholic teas and so on. And I understand why people do these things, but equally, I think that people should be championing beer as much as possible. Alternative paradigms. The brewing process is reasonably traditional. It gets modified by tweaking. From time to time, including myself, we've done work on finding alternative ways, possibly, of making some of these products. I'm not a fan, but equally, there is every reason why, particularly if people are moving in the direction of things like alcoholic seltzers, why should they be doing things, unless it's for tax reasons, doing things in traditional ways? We must always have mind towards responsibility and people's image of beer. Beer does not have a great image in some parts of the world. People talk about beer bellies and so on. But we've done a lot of work showing and demonstrating, confirming that beer is probably the healthiest adult beverage on the planet when consumed in moderation. But equally, I personally think there's a lot of benefit to being presenting people with the option for lower alcohol products, not necessarily alcohol free, but lower alcohol products. So the image of beer, I think it's very important that brewers and people who enjoy beer should be building it up, to be stressing how it can be a part of a healthy diet. It is probably the best thing you can pair with food. Because there's such diversity and so many diverse foods. But we should always be stressing a responsibility. And in terms of that, of course, mindful of environmental issues, water usage, energy usage, volatile organic compounds, emissions, co-products, and so on. It can be a fairly intense process. And so much of the research is and should be focused on environmental issues and recognizing that beer can be produced in a highly environmentally friendly way. So the bottom line, ladies and gentlemen, is it is about education, educating the brewer, and UC Davis has a long-standing job in that area, but also in educating the consumer and educating people selling beer and stressing that beer is of adult beverages. Thank you very much for your attention.